Hello everybody, Jeanette here and welcome to the Neal's Homestead. Here's old guy behind me working on onions as I speak to you. As we approach the 4th of July, it's getting close to total onion harvest time. Now for a couple of weeks we've been pulling some onions. We go through and we pick the bigger ones and we've been selling them at the Amish produce auction. But as 4th of July comes and at that time we need to get mostly all of them out of the ground. At this point I want to look at whether we think growing them in the high tunnel like we did part of our onions or growing them outside in black plastic mulch in the open air was better. So thanks for joining us.
Today we're picking and cleaning onions, getting ready to take them to the Amish auction on Friday. And today we picked them from our outside onions. We planted some onions inside in our high tunnel, and we planted some on the outside in the field. And it's always hard to tell which works the best because conditions are never the same year to year. What we picked today are much larger from the outside field than what we've been picking, but we've been picking for 2 weeks on the ones in the house inside instead of letting them grow. So I don't really know what the variance is in them. But onions are my favorite crop for marketing. There's some things that I've learned you need to do if you're going to raise onions or any other crop. The number one thing is on onions, I like to pre-apply 300 pounds per acre of 20-20-20 fertilizer. And then from the time I plant the onions up till 30 days before I harvest, I like to add an additional through the water line 70 pounds per acre of nitrogen. That pretty well assures you of averaging a pretty good crop. Another thing I like to do, which I figure is an absolute must, which goes against a lot of people's grain, but just the same, I like to put down trephland on my ground pre-plant, because if you don't, you cannot keep the grass out. Anytime you plant and have grass or weeds in your crops, you've automatically lost a minimum of 50% of your crop, plus the quality will never be anywhere close if you've got grass and weeds. I like to put down trephland because it does a good job on grass particularly and most weeds. Because of last year's failure and the fact that we wasn't going to do marketing gardening this year, we had 2 empty houses, and so I decided I want to plant onions in that, and I'm glad it did because the weather was so bad for so long that you can go ahead and work inside. And as far as which is the best, one thing I have against planting outside is I have to run the tractor and plow over the ground, then I have to run the tiller over twice more, and then we have to run the plastic layer, water line layer once, and then it's such a fast moving job we have to go 2 or 3 trips over it to plant the onions because one person cannot keep up planting an onion every 6 inches. And so we have to run over it. And so doing all that running over the land, especially on a year with a lot of moisture, you can't keep packing your ground down running a tractor on it. But in the house, I plan to row every 12 inches. That's a lot of bending. And in those 2 houses, we probably planted around 6,000 plants. Jan planted most of them, so that's a lot harder on the back. But then again, it's still hard on the back riding that planter 2 or 3 rounds to get to one planted outside. I don't know which is the best.
The second week of March, I picked up 5 cases of onion plants, and believe me, that's a lot of onion plants. We had number 2 and number 3 high tunnels ready to go, ready to be planted. We brought them home. We were able to start almost immediately, and the way we planted in here is rows only 12 inches apart and the onions 6 inches apart in the row. And it took a lot of bending over. I'm not able to get down on the ground and crawl around, which is Old Guy's preferred way to plant. And that's not easy, but I have to bend over, and spending 2 days bent over was kind of torture for me, but we got it done. After we got the 2 high tunnels planted, then we basically had to wait. We had run drip lines down through the high tunnels, so we were able to water and fertilize through those drip lines. As the weeds started growing, then we saw we had another bit of a deal where it's really close in there, only this far apart to get in and try to keep the weeds pulled out. We spent hours and hours pulling weeds in these 2 high tunnels, and we didn't win, but we didn't totally lose either. We can still see the onions, but there's a lot of grass and weeds growing in there. A week later, we planted the onions outside in a field over back that way, and we had to lay black plastic mulch with a drip line into it. We had to use the tractor to drive along, and with the transplanter, I planted each onion plant in the plastic with the planter poking holes. To me, that was easier to do than bending over for 2 days. The weed control out there is easier because the black plastic mulch covers the ground and makes it so that the weeds can't grow under the plastic. However, every time you poke a hole and put a skinny little onion plant in there, there's a lot more soil that's exposed to the sunlight around that onion plant, and weeds want to grow up into that area. And if you don't clean them out 2 or 3 times every year, the little holes, then at the end, when it's time to harvest, you're going to have a bunch of weeds to contend with. And those weeds out there, well fertilized, can get up over your head. I've done that a lot of times, and it's no fun to harvest in that kind of conditions. Fertilizing and watering are basically the same because we do use a drip line system in either one, with a fertilizer injector that we put into the water through the drip line into each one, so I can't see that that's any different. Last year, because it was so cold for so long, we lost most of our onion crop, which is what caused us to want to do these 2 hoop houses this year and give it a try. I think Old Guy is convinced that this is the way to go. I'm not quite so convinced, because I think this year we're getting overall, but not entirely, a better harvest in the plants that are grown outside. The harvesting has been pretty similar. It is easier to pop the onions out of the plastic than it is to go in here and kind of find where they are, especially with the weeds. But I think overall the harvesting of the onions in either place is not very much different. Just wanted to give you an update on what we experienced with growing onions in a high tunnel versus out in the open, and what we thought of the outcome. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.